Well, you can understand emotions as one of many of the products of the brain. It's biochemical processes, and there are specific parts of the brain that appear to mediate, produce, and respond to emotions. But not only specific parts of the brain, but it's spread throughout the brain. There appears to be specialized mechanisms in the brain that respond and produce emotional behaviors, if you will, but not in isolation. And so, as it turns out, that's a pretty good question, because what evolutionary psychology is going to claim is that it's not behaviors that are evolved, but underlying motivations. And those motivations manifest themselves in terms of emotional predispositions.
So do the emotions originate in the brain?
Yes. And the reason I hesitate is because, I mean, there are interesting... Does your mind stop at your skull? Your brain does, but does your mind stop at the skull? Yes. Go ahead. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
We also have neurotransmitters and serotonin and cellular throughout our body, and a physical reaction can trigger an emotional.
There are neurons that are in your intestines,
Right.
and so you can think about the nervous system as is beyond the brain and the spinal cord, but also neurons and neural tissue in the intestines, for example. But that's not what I mean by whether it stops at the skull. Yes.
You're talking about situated cognition?
I'm talking about what my friend Jack has brought up, which is situated cognition, embodied cognition. That it doesn't really make sense to talk about a mind in isolation of the body that it inhabits or the context in which it's expressed. So in a sense, when I had said earlier that we are like open circuits completed only with interaction with the environment then becomes a really important part of what we mean by mind. Because the mind reacts to and causes effects in environment beyond the limitations of our skull. But do they originate? Let me put it to you this way. Without a brain, there would probably be nothing to interact with. So in that sense, yeah. I mean, evolutionary psychologists are committed to the philosophy of naturalism. And by and large, materialism. We are material beings. We are part of a material universe, and we can make sense of ourselves in that context. We can make sense of ourselves in other contexts too, but we wonder whether that's a sensible thing to do. And I think some of you know what I'm talking about. Yes, ma'am.
Can you please define what you mean by mind? I think you have some sort of,
Well, that's, yeah. A mind, it refers to both the conscious, intentional, non-conscious, unintentional mechanisms that guide an organism's behavior as it works its way through an environment. I'm not talking about consciousness, what it's like to be. I don't know how consciousness arises in a brain. Nobody knows. Nobody. I don't know that it's even knowable. I think it is, but I don't know. So I don't talk about consciousness in here. I talk about that in another class I teach. Talk about mind. So I think artifacts can have minds. Computers, for example, robots. All right, let's move on. Okay, this leads to a pretty radical claim. And here's the claim. A complete understanding, a grand unified theory, a theory of everything with respect to mind, A complete understanding of the human mind is possible only within an evolutionary framework. That you can come to understand aspects of the mind, what are so-called micro-theories, the trichromatic theory of color perception, the opponent process theory of color perception, corollary discharge theory of motion perception. There's all these little micro-theories, but none of those theories make sense, this claim. You can't organize them unless they're embodied in a wider meta-theoretical framework, and that's the evolutionary framework. But that's not nearly as radical, maybe, as Dubinsky in 1973, a Russian evolutionary biologist, an Orthodox Christian, who claimed nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. If we are part of the biology, nothing about us in the end makes sense except in the light of evolution. But that's not even the most radical claim, because Dubinsky was influenced and highly impressed with another person, Chardin, a Jesuit priest. You got to love the Jesuits. Here's his statement. Evolution is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforth bow, in which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thoughts must follow. This is what evolution is. Philosopher, theologian. This did not put him in good standing with the church.
But can you take one part of the theory without taking the rest? Because I know a great quote of his, which is, joy is the most infallible test of the presence of God. So he would then you would have to, if you're looking at Chardin, include his idea of what God is.
Yes, as a matter of fact, he was strongly arguing for theistic evolution. That evolution occurs, but God was in charge. And so, yes, he was an evolutionist, but he was also a theologian. And so, yes, so that fits. And I would say that statement, I have no idea what it means.
Which one?
The statement you just said.
Joy.
Yeah, well, I'll have a seance. What's that thing that's going on with the... Okay, a few more words. Just a few more words. This is from Tooby and Cosmides in 2005 at a talk. I believe this is at Long Beach at a conference. Evolutionary psychology is a long forestalled scientific attempt to assemble out of the disjointed, fragmentary, and mutually contradictory human disciplines a single, logically integrated research framework for the psychological, social, and behavioral sciences. A framework that not only incorporates the evolutionary sciences on a full and equal basis, but that systematically works out all the revisions in existing belief and research practice that such a synthesis requires. This is a very strong statement. And what it suggests, and this is in part, these sentiments are in part why even in my discipline, evolutionary psychology is held held suspect. People look at it askance and wonder, what's going on with this evolutionary stuff? I'm the only one in my department that really fully embraces evolutionary psych. There's a couple other people who have nods to it. But what I tell my graduate students who are going off to PhD programs who are interested in this is do not mention evolutionary psychology. Just don't mention that's what you want to do. You want to understand the underlying mechanisms associated with visual processing and the natural mechanisms that are in play, fine. But you say that word, evolutionary psychology, and it's hard to tell how people are going to respond. Evolutionary psychologists are all over the place, but they tend to be fairly isolated in their own departments. Okay, so it's a synthesis. Evolutionary psychology is the synthesis of at least these four broad, important areas of inquiry. One, of course, is evolutionary theory, and in its most standard form as an adaptationist approach to understanding how things work. But not only general evolutionary theory, but intermediate theories, mid-level theories, parental investment theory, inclusive fitness theory, sexual selection theory. These theories are mid-level theories that were developed in the mid-60s, early 70s by W.D. Hamilton. That's inclusive fitness theory. And you had Trivers, who did some seminal work in the parent-offspring conflict. The idea is that there was, by definition, based on this, you will always have conflict between parents and siblings themselves will always exhibit some kind of conflict because they're in competition for resources. And so those mid-level theories turn out to be really important, and they are recurrent generators of hypotheses across a variety of domains. Cognitive psychology, this is my area of study, has tried to elucidate underlying structure using information processing as a metaphor. What is the structure of the human mind? We have short-term memory, long-term memory. What's the underlying codes? Is it a visual code? Is it a propositional code? How is it stored in memory? Cognitive psychology is really very much the engineers of psychology in trying to understand the brain from an engineering point of view, a structure, process point of view. Computer science has contributed to this with respect to its emphasis on computation. The idea that the brain is a computer, not like a regular computer on your desktop, but what it has in common with a computer is that it processes information. That's what it does. Not figuratively, literally. There are philosophers and other people who take issue with computationalism, as many of you probably are aware. And then neuropsychology. Neuropsychology is a fabulous area. It's taking a look at the microstructure of the brain and how that structure is put together in the neural wetware, if you will. The identification of specialized circuits in the brain. And so neuropsychologists have identified a variety of very interesting parts of the brain that do very specific things. What's interesting about neuropsych is that we're getting to the point now where we're going to be able to monitor brain processes in parallel to be able to get at, understand, and look exactly is where are these mechanisms operating and how are they operating and under what conditions are they being elicited. When you pull together evolutionary theory, cognitive psychology, computer science, neuropsychology, you get the grand nexus called evolutionary psychology. Yes, sir?
So I wonder when you're talking about like the parental conflict or I forget which specific theory.
Parent-offspring conflict.
It seems like, I mean, I understand the explanatory reasons for doing research in that, but it doesn't really help us out because even if you could, make an egalitarian distribution of resources among parents and offspring, there's still going to be conflict. So it seems like I just wonder if you'd comment on is there any real like practical application of a theory like that, or is it really just an explanatory tool?
Well, the extent to which any theory is accurate in its explanation of a phenomenon is the extent to which you're in a position to be able to make predictions and modify behavior based on the parameters elucidated by that theory. And so, is parent-offspring conflict inevitable? According to this theory, it is. It is inevitable. Is it inevitable that that conflict will lead to a despairing situation? No. Absolutely not. If there are things that happen in our culture, or behaviors that you express or that your fellow naked apes express, that you dislike, that we dislike as a culture, the extent to which we understand the underlying mechanisms that are in play, that elicit those behaviors, is the extent to which we're in a position to be able to modify behaviors by changing the environmental triggers to those behaviors in a way that's informed by the underlying structure of the brain. That's sort of the a priori response. How to get you to stop hitting your sister? Just say, stop hitting your sister. And have some other structures that come into play, like your sense of altruism, cooperation.